The smell of burnt flesh still clung to her skin. It was not only from this morning, but from nights before, when the iron had kissed her body again and again. Some wounds were raw and blistered. Others had already turned dark, cracked, and scarred. Every mark told a story, each one carved by the same hands that once held her with promises of forever. Eliza hung against the post inside the forge, her wrists bound so tight the ropes had cut the skin open. Her swollen belly pressed forward as if begging for air, but the heat from the furnace wrapped around her like a suffocating blanket. Her breath came in gasps, her head drooping, strands of hair sticking to the sweat on her cheeks. Her body was a battlefield of old pain and fresh cruelty. Every time she shifted, the burns on her thighs screamed, and the bruises on her arms whispered of nights when fists had fallen harder than the hammer on the anvil. The forge roared, iron glowing bright red in the flames. The tools of work had become weapons of torment. She could not count the days anymore. Sometimes Caleb left her tied for hours. Sometimes he returned only to shove her closer to the fire, watching her cry as if her tears were fuel. She had once believed his strength meant protection, that his arms were built to shield her from the harsh world of the West. Now she knew better. Those arms were built to break her spirit. Her lips cracked as she whispered to the silence, "It hurts inside too." The words were not only about her body, but about her soul, bruised and burned beyond what anyone should endure. She closed her eyes, whispering to the child inside her, "Please, just hold on. Please don't leave me too." The door creaked open. Heavy footsteps echoed on the dirt. Her heart stopped. Was he back already? But the figure who stepped into the forge was not Caleb. It was a tall rancher, worn boots dusty from the trail. A red scarf knotted at his neck. Jed had come only to buy a set of horseshoes, and he had no idea that behind the smoke of the forge, behind the heat of the fire, there was a nightmare bound to a post. Jed froze in the doorway. At first he thought his eyes were playing tricks, but then Eliza lifted her head, her eyes glassy with tears, her voice trembling like a dying flame. "It hurt inside too. Please, save my baby. If I stay here, I will lose it." The words cut through him sharper than any blade. He had seen storms destroy ranches, seen men fall in duels, but never had he seen suffering like this. Every scar on her body shouted louder than her voice. This was not the sight of a woman who had simply fallen on hard times. This was torture, deliberate and merciless. Jed stepped forward, the crunch of his boots echoing in the silence. He reached for the ropes, his hands shaking as he saw the deep grooves in her wrists, the fresh blood staining the fibers. He cut them loose, and Eliza collapsed into his arms, too weak to stand. Her weight was nothing compared to the burden of what he had just witnessed. He carried her out of the forge, away from the suffocating heat, into the open air where the sunlight still shone. The wind touched her skin, and for the first time in days, maybe weeks, she breathed something other than smoke and fear. Jed looked back at the forge, its flames still alive, its fire still hungry. What kind of man could leave his wife to burn like that? And what would happen when that man returned? Jed laid her gently on the wooden bench inside an abandoned shed not far from the forge. The sun slipped through the cracks of the wall, warm light falling across her face. For the first time in hours, maybe days, Eliza was breathing air that was not poisoned with smoke. He gave her a small flask of water. She drank with trembling hands, spilling drops down her chin, then pressed her palm to her belly as if to calm the child within. Jed waited in silence. He was not a man who asked too many questions. The West had taught him that sometimes answers came only when a soul was ready to speak. After a long pause, she whispered, "I used to work at the saloon in town." Her voice cracked, not from shame, but from the weight of memory. "Caleb never trusted me. Every man who looked my way became a reason for him to strike me. People in town started talking too, and those whispers cut just as deep as his fists." Jed said nothing. He just nodded, his eyes steady, letting her know he was listening. "I ran away once." Her eyes filled with tears again. "I thought I could escape. I thought I could start over, but I had nowhere to go. After a few weeks, I came back. And by then he was already convinced. He said I had been with another man, that the child inside me was not his. From that day on, he made me pay for a sin I never committed." The words hung heavy in the air. Jed felt his jaw tighten. He had seen cruelty before, but this was something else. This was a husband turning love into punishment. A blacksmith who no longer shaped iron, but tried to shape fear into the life of his own wife. Eliza's hands shook as she touched her burns. "These scars," she said softly. "They are not accidents." He held me near the fire. He pressed the iron close just to watch me flinch. And when I cried, he said I deserved it. Jed clenched his fist, forcing himself to stay calm. A man who had lived 50 years on the frontier knew that anger burned fast and faded. But resolve could move mountains. And right now, he needed resolve. He looked at her, his voice low and steady. "You are safe now. As long as I'm standing, he will never touch you again." For the first time. She gave him a faint smile, fragile as morning light breaking through storm clouds. But even as she rested, even as Jed promised protection, the ground outside carried the sound of heavy boots. The blacksmith had returned. The sound of boots grew louder outside the shed. Jed stood up, his hand instinctively resting near the knife on his belt. Eliza's breath quickened, and she clutched her belly as if to shield the child. The door slammed open. And there he was. Caleb filled the doorway. Sweat and soot smeared across his face. The blacksmith's chest rose and fell like a bull ready to charge. His eyes locked on Eliza, then on Jed. And a cruel smile spread across his face. "So," Caleb growled, "I knew it. You ran to him. You always wanted him, didn't you?" Jed stayed silent. He was not the kind of man to waste words when action might be needed, but Eliza shook her head, tears falling down her cheeks. "No, Caleb, I never—" Her voice cracked before she could finish. Caleb raised the heavy blacksmith's hammer he carried. "Don't lie to me. The whole town whispers about you, and now I see it with my own eyes. You, in his arms, you, hiding behind him like a guilty woman." Jed stepped forward, his voice low but steady. "Put the hammer down. She's not guilty of anything. You know it. Deep down, you know it." But Caleb was past reason. With a roar, he swung the hammer. Jed moved fast, pulling Eliza behind him and drawing the knife from his belt. The hammer crashed against the wooden beam, sending splinters flying. Jed countered with a slash across Caleb's arm, not deep, but enough to stagger the blacksmith. The two men circled, one with iron, one with steel, the air thick with dust and the smell of blood. Eliza cried out, begging them to stop, but her words were lost in the clash of wood, fire, and fury. Caleb swung again, his hammer grazing Jed's shoulder, sending pain shooting down his side. Jed gritted his teeth, planted his boots in the dirt, and shoved Caleb back with all his strength. For a moment the blacksmith stumbled, his hammer clattering to the floor. Jed raised his knife, but he did not strike. His voice thundered instead. "Enough. You've done enough damage. This ends here," Eliza sobbed, her voice breaking the silence. "Caleb, please. The child is yours. Stop before it is too late." For a heartbeat, Caleb froze, his face twisted, torn between rage and doubt. But then, the sound of hooves thundered outside. The law had arrived. Jed's eyes never left Caleb's as the marshal's voice rang out behind them. "Drop the hammer. Step away." The blacksmith's fate was now in the hands of justice, and for the first time, Jed felt that maybe, just maybe, Eliza would be safe. "Now, my friend, if you are still with me, take a sip of tea, lean back, and let this story sink in. Tell me, what time is it where you are, and where are you listening from? And if you want to keep riding with me through more Wild West stories, and hit that subscribe button so you never miss the next chapter." The fight shook the walls of the old shed. Jed's knife flashed, Caleb's hammer swung, and the sound of iron striking wood echoed across the field. Dust filled the air, and Eliza cried out, begging them to stop, her voice breaking like glass. Then, from outside, came the sound of boots. The door swung open, and a deep voice cut through the chaos. "Enough! Put it down!" It was Sheriff Morgan, a man who had ridden these roads longer than most had been alive. He had been on patrol, passing the edge of the property, when he heard the clash of steel and the cries of a woman. Now he stood in the doorway, hand resting on his revolver, eyes cold as stone. Jed froze, his chest heaving, his knife still in hand. Caleb glared at the sheriff, his hammer trembling. torn between rage and fear. "This is none of your business, Morgan," Caleb growled. "My wife, my home. Get out." The sheriff stepped inside, calm but firm. "Not when I hear fighting, not when I hear her scream." "Drop the hammer." For a moment, Caleb hesitated. Then Jed spoke, his voice sharp with anger. "Do as he said." "You've done enough damage already." Caleb roared and lunged again, but the sheriff was faster. The revolver cleared its holster, the hammer cocked, and the sound of the weapon froze the blacksmith in his tracks. His hammer slipped from his hand, landing with a dull thud on the floor. The sheriff moved quickly, binding Caleb's wrists with rope. His face unreadable, Jed lowered his knife, finally letting out the breath he had been holding. Eliza slid down against the wall, shaking, holding her belly, tears running down her face. Morgan glanced at her, then at Jed. "What happened here?" Jed opened his mouth, but Eliza's whisper came first. "He hurt me. He tied me up. He wanted me to burn." The sheriff's eyes narrowed. He had suspected Caleb of being a hard man, but this was something darker, something crueler than the law of the frontier could ignore. He looked at the burns on her arms, the cuts on her wrists, the terror in her eyes. He tightened the knots around Caleb's hands, pulling him to his feet. "You'll answer for this. Every mark on her body will speak louder than your lies." Caleb tried to twist away, shouting curses, but the sheriff dragged him outside into the sunlight. The blacksmith, who had once stood proud, was now nothing more than a prisoner, his rage stripped of power. Jed helped Eliza up. Steadying her, she leaned into him. Her body trembled, but for the first time, she was no longer alone. The sheriff looked back at them and nodded. "This is just the start. We'll get the truth, all of it." And with those words, Jed knew the fire had not won. But could Eliza ever heal from the scars Caleb left behind? Or would they haunt her forever? The sheriff took Caleb away, his curses fading into the distance until only silence remained. Jed stood there in the doorway of the shed, the light of the evening sun spilling across his shoulders. Beside him, Eliza leaned against his arm, her body weak but her spirit still alive. For the first time in years, she was no longer bound by ropes or by fear. Days turned into weeks. Jed opened his ranch to her, a place where the wind carried the scent of grass instead of smoke, where the only fire burned gently in the hearth and not in a forge meant to scar. Eliza slowly healed. The scars on her skin would never vanish, but the ones on her heart began to soften each time she heard Jed's steady voice telling her she was safe. When the time came, the cries of a newborn filled the ranch house. Jed stood nearby, rough hands trembling as he held the child for the first time. Eliza watched through tears, whispering, "You gave us life twice. Once when you pulled me from the fire, and again when you gave this child a home." Seasons passed. One afternoon, the boy, barely steady on his feet, toddled across the porch. His little arms reached toward Jed, his voice bright and clear. "Papa." Jed froze, his eyes stinging, his heart heavy with emotions he could not put into words. In that single word, the child had given him something more powerful than any victory, more lasting than any fight. He had given him family, and maybe that is the true lesson of this story. The West was filled with violence, dust, and men who believed strength came from the fist or the gun. But real strength is found in the quiet choice to protect, to care, to love. Scars may remain, but they can remind us not only of pain, but of survival. Do we let the fire define us, or do we rise from it stronger than before? Now I ask you, if you were Jed, would you have stepped inside that forge? Would you have risked your life for someone others had already judged? And if you were Eliza, could you still believe in love after so much cruelty? Think about that for a moment, my friend. And if this story touched you, take a second to like the video. It helps more people find these Wild West tales. Hit subscribe so you do not miss the next ride across the frontier with me. And while you are here, pour yourself another cup of tea, lean back and tell me in the comment, what time is it where you are and where are you listening from?